The grand gala for Blake Enterprises was held at one of the most prestigious venues in downtown New York City. For Alexander Knight, the CEO of one of the leading tech firms in the country, this event was just another networking opportunity. But tonight felt different. Despite being at the top of his game, surrounded by successful businessmen and high-profile investors, he couldn't shake the sense of unease. Everything he had built, everything he'd worked for, suddenly seemed fragile. The weight of his past, his failed relationships, the constant pressure to succeed was bearing down on him. Alexander wasn't a man who believed in fate or destiny, but at that moment, he wondered if he was standing on the edge of something monumental, something beyond his control, as he stepped into the large ballroom. The shimmering lights and murmurs of conversation filled the air. The glint of champagne glasses and the flash of cameras made it feel like any other high-profile business event. But then, as his eyes scanned the room, someone caught his attention. Emily Cooper entered the room with quiet confidence. She wasn't strikingly beautiful in the traditional sense. Her beauty was subtle, almost ethereal, but it was her presence, the way she moved with purpose, that made heads turn. She wore a classic white blouse tucked into black tailored pants, with a navy blazer draped elegantly over her shoulders. She wasn't trying to steal the spotlight, but it was clear she had no intention of being ignored. For Alexander, everything seemed to slow down when their eyes met. There was an instant, strange connection, a spark that he couldn't quite explain. She wasn't like the women he usually encountered at these events, those who fawned over his power and status. Emily's gaze was steady, intense, and far from impressed by his reputation. As the event continued, Alexander found himself watching her from across the room. Their paths crossed once more as they both moved toward the bar. She nodded to him, acknowledging his presence, but there was no fawning, no polite small talk. Instead, she smiled faintly. "Mr. Knight," she said, extending her hand. "Emily Cooper. I'll be handling the financial strategy for the upcoming projects." Alexander shook her hand, surprised by her calm demeanor. "Nice to meet you, Miss Cooper," he replied, his tone professional, but there was something in her eyes that made him uneasy. Something told him that Emily was more than just another employee in his company. The conversation was brief, but something about it lingered in Alexander's mind. She was different from anyone he had met before. There was a cool confidence in the way she spoke, a nonsense attitude that set her apart from the usual sycophants who orbited him. As the night wore on, he couldn't help but wonder about her. Emily's first few days at Blake Enterprises didn't go smoothly. Despite her impressive credentials and the fact that she was assigned a key role in overseeing the financial strategies for a major new initiative, she found herself constantly bumping into walls. The corporate culture at Blake Enterprises was cutthroat, and the male-dominated atmosphere was not exactly welcoming to a young woman trying to make her mark. On the other hand, Alexander had his doubts about Emily. She was sharp, no doubt, but there was something about her that didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was her confidence or her insistence on challenging him during meetings. She wasn't afraid to question his strategies or suggest alternative solutions, and that irritated him more than he cared to admit. One afternoon, during a heated discussion about an upcoming investment project, Emily proposed an ambitious financial move that Alexander immediately rejected. He had always taken a conservative approach to risk, and Emily's suggestion seemed reckless to him. "This isn't the time for high-risk moves," Alexander said firmly. "We're talking about millions of dollars here. We can't afford to gamble." Emily didn't back down. "Sometimes You need to take calculated risks to move forward. If we play it too safe, we'll be left behind." Her words stung. Alexander didn't like being questioned, especially in front of his team. "I understand the concept of risk, Miss Cooper," he said, his voice cool. "But we're not in a position to take unnecessary chances." That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Alexander realized how much her words had affected him. It wasn't just about the project. It was about how Emily had challenged him in a way no one else had. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was a threat to his authority. And that was something he wasn't used to over the next few weeks. Alexander found himself increasingly at odds with Emily. Every meeting seemed to turn into a battle of wills. She didn't take orders well, and she had a way of forcing him to question his methods. It was infuriating, but at the same time, it intrigued him. There was no denying her intelligence or drive. Emily wasn't just some young employee trying to climb the corporate ladder. She was ambitious, talented, and fiercely independent. Despite their differences, there were moments when Alexander couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for her. She wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. Emily was used to fighting for what she wanted, and she didn't let anyone, least of all him, dictate her path. One evening, as they both stayed late at the office to work on an urgent project, Alexander found himself in her office, watching her as she focused on her computer screen. There was a quiet intensity about her that made him pause. "Why do you push so hard?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer than usual. Emily glanced up, surprised by the question. "Because if I don't, no one will. No one's going to hand me success. I have to earn it." There was something in her voice, something raw, that struck a chord with Alexander. He had spent his life building his empire, but Emily was different. She wasn't here just to survive. She was here to prove something. The weeks following their initial clash only intensified the tension between Alexander and Emily. What started as small disagreements in meetings gradually turned into full-blown confrontations. Each time they spoke, it felt like they were challenging each other, pushing their limits, both professionally and personally. Alexander prided himself on his ability to control situations. He had built his empire from the ground up through discipline, strategy, and sheer willpower. Emily, however, was a breath of fresh air in his carefully orchestrated world. She didn't play by the rules, and that unsettled him. Yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about her. Emily wasn't just challenging him professionally. She was questioning the very foundation of everything he believed in. Her bold ideas pushed him to think differently, and for the first time in years, he found himself reconsidering his approach to business. But that didn't mean he liked it. One evening, Alexander stayed late at the office, going over the final details of a massive project the company had been working on for months. Emily had done the same, though her focus was on a different section of the plan. Despite their ongoing conflict, there was no denying how well they complemented each other in their work. As the night wore on, the tension that had simmered between them finally came to a head. Emily knocked gently on his door, stepping into his office without waiting for a response. Alexander looked up, surprised to see her. She looked different tonight. There was a certain wariness in her eyes, and the usual sharpness had softened, if only slightly. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "We're close to finalizing this deal, but there's a huge flaw in the plan that no one's noticed. If we don't address it, the entire project could fall apart." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You always have something to say, don't you?" Emily wasn't intimidated. She stood her ground, meeting his gaze. I'm not saying this to challenge you, Alexander. I'm saying it because I care about the success of this company, just like you do. For a moment, Alexander didn't know how to respond. This was a side of Emily he hadn't seen before, sincere, focused, and determined. She wasn't trying to undermine him. She was trying to help him. All right, let's hear it, he said, his voice low. As Emily walked him through the potential flaw in their strategy, Alexander was stunned by her insight. She had spotted something no one else had, and it could potentially save the project from disaster. For the first time in weeks, he found himself truly impressed. We need to adjust the timeline and restructure the risk analysis. The numbers don't add up the way we've projected them, Emily said, her tone firm but not condescending. We need to do this before it's too late. Alexander stayed silent for a moment, processing her words. He had a reputation for being hard to impress, but here he was, seeing her in a completely new light. Emily had just saved him from a major failure and, in doing so, had earned his respect. You're right, he admitted, his voice softer than usual. I hadn't seen it. I didn't consider that angle. Emily's face softened, and for a brief second, their professional distance seemed to fade. That's why we're a team, Alexander. We make each other better. Alexander nodded, feeling a strange warmth in his chest that he hadn't expected. I'll make the changes. Let's get this right. As Emily turned to leave, Alexander stopped her. Wait, Emily, ... She paused, looking back at him, her eyes searching his face. You've earned my respect tonight, he said, surprising both of them. I'll admit, I've been hard on you. But you're right. This company needs people who think differently, who challenge the status quo. Emily smiled slightly, but it wasn't the usual confident smile. There was something deeper, there's something personal. Thank you. That means a lot. As the days passed, the project moved forward smoothly, thanks to Emily's quick thinking. But something had shifted between her and Alexander. The walls they had built around each other were beginning to crack. It wasn't just about the business anymore. There was a growing respect, maybe even something more, beneath the surface. However, neither of them were ready to admit it yet. The next morning, Alexander found himself thinking about Emily more than he cared to admit. Her intelligence, her boldness, her unwavering confidence, it all fascinated him. She wasn't afraid to challenge him, and that, more than anything, had earned her a place in his world. That afternoon, after a successful meeting with clients, Alexander caught sight of Emily across the room. She was talking with one of the senior executives, but she looked up and caught his eye for a split second. Something passed between them in that moment, a brief connection, a silent understanding. But before either of them could acknowledge it, Emily turned back to the conversation, her focus unwavering. Alexander couldn't help but wonder, what was it about her that made him feel this way? Days passed, and the dynamic between Alexander and Emily continued to shift. They found themselves spending more time working together, pushing through difficult projects that seemed insurmountable at first. But with each challenge, they came to rely on each other more, understanding that they were stronger as a team than as two separate forces. The company had started to recover from the previous setbacks. Emily's strategic thinking had saved their most critical project, and for the first time in a while, Alexander allowed himself to feel optimistic about the future. He even began looking forward to their late-night strategy sessions, where their conversations stretched beyond the numbers and into deeper discussions. about their personal lives. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting, Alexander and Emily found themselves alone in the office. The lights of the city outside flickered like stars, casting a soft glow over their workspace. "Good work today," Alexander said, looking over the project timelines on his desk. Emily nodded, but there was a quiet tension in her eyes. "Thanks. I think we're finally starting to make some real progress." She paused for a moment, and Alexander couldn't help but notice the subtle change in her tone, almost as if she was holding something back. "You're different tonight," he observed. "What's going on?" Emily hesitated, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm in too deep, you know. I've spent my whole life working towards something, and now that I'm here, it feels like I'm about to lose it all." Alexander raised an eyebrow, surprised by her vulnerability. He had never seen this side of her before, and it made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. Emily was always so confident, so composed, but now her walls were down, and he could sense her uncertainty. "You're not alone in this," Alexander said softly. "We're in this together." For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and the weight of his words hung in the air between them. Something unspoken passed between them, a connection that neither of them had the courage to acknowledge fully. As the evening wore on, the conversation drifted from work to more personal topics. Emily spoke of her past, how she had worked tirelessly to get where she was, overcoming doubts and obstacles along the way. She shared a bit about her family, how her father's expectations had always loomed large, pushing her to constantly prove herself. "I've never been good at asking for help," she admitted. "I've always been the one people rely on, the one who's supposed to have everything figured out." Alexander listened intently, his thoughts racing. He realized how much he didn't know about her, how much she kept hidden behind her strong exterior. Emily had always been the perfect professional, but now he was seeing a side of her that was raw and real, a side he found himself drawn to. "I get that," Alexander said, his voice quieter now. "I've always felt like I had to do everything on my own, to be perfect, to never let anyone see weakness." Emily turned to face him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Perfect," she repeated, her voice teasing. "You're hardly perfect, Alexander," he chuckled, appreciating her light-hearted response, but his smile faded when he saw the sincerity in her eyes. "I guess we both have our own ways of coping with the pressure." They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. The vulnerability they'd shared felt new and familiar, and yet, in that moment, it felt right, as if they had both crossed some invisible boundary in their professional relationship, moving into a space that was no longer about business alone. As the clock ticked on, Alexander found himself fighting an internal battle. There was an undeniable pull between them, a chemistry that had been growing ever since their first meeting, but he had always kept his emotions in check, believing that mixing business and pleasure was dangerous. And yet, Emily was different. She wasn't like the women he had been involved with before. She was strong, independent, and, despite everything, still managed to make him feel things he hadn't felt in a long time. But he couldn't let himself fall for her. Not now. Not with everything at stake. "Emily," Alexander began, his voice a little strained, "we should probably get some rest. Tomorrow's another big day, and we've still got a lot of work ahead." Emily nodded, but there was a brief flicker of disappointment in her eyes before she quickly masked it. "Yeah, you're right. Good night, Alexander." As she turned to leave, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them, something neither of them was ready to face. And as much as he tried to convince himself that they were simply colleagues working together to achieve a common goal, he couldn't ignore the deeper connection that was slowly, inevitably, pulling them later that week. After another intense day of meetings and strategy sessions, Alexander found himself standing outside the office, staring at the skyline. He had always been a man of control, but for the first time, he felt like he was losing his grip on everything. He stepped out into the hallway to clear his mind, only to find Emily standing there, looking out the window at the city below. The atmosphere between them had shifted. There was a weight in the air that neither of them could ignore without saying a word. Emily turned to face him, and for the first time, there was a softness in her eyes, a vulnerability that Alexander hadn't seen before. It was like everything they had been holding back, everything they had been avoiding, was suddenly right in front of them. In that moment, everything around them seemed to fade away. The walls between them came crashing down, and without thinking, Alexander reached out and gently cupped her face. Emily didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. And before either of them could say anything more, their lips met in a kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as the tension between them finally exploded. For a moment, there was nothing else in the world. Just the two of them, finally giving in to the pull they had been resisting for so long. The kiss had lingered in Alexander's mind far longer than he had anticipated. What had begun as a brief moment of vulnerability between two colleagues quickly became something much more complex. The chemistry between him and Emily wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something neither of them could ignore. But as much as he wanted to deny it, Alexander knew this was a dangerous path. They were both key players in the same company, both fiercely ambitious, and both unwilling to show weakness. In the cutthroat world of business, relationships like this could quickly turn into liabilities. He couldn't afford to be distracted. For Emily, the kiss had stirred feelings she had long buried. She had always kept her emotions in check, focusing solely on her career and goals. But with Alexander, it was different. There was a part of her that wanted to let go, to give in to the connection they shared. But another part of her knew better. She had worked too hard to let anything, especially a complicated relationship, derail her future. The next morning, both of them acted as if nothing had happened. They exchanged polite words in the office, carefully avoiding any mention of the kiss. But the air between them was thick with tension. The unspoken truth hovered in the background, a quiet storm waiting to break. As the days passed, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had changed. She had spent years building her career and fighting for her place in the corporate world. She had sacrificed relationships and personal connections, knowing that the price of success was steep. But now, with Alexander, everything felt more uncertain. The kiss had awakened something inside, her something she wasn't sure she was ready to deal with. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful meeting, Emily found herself standing in the balcony of her office, looking out at the city below. The cold wind blew through her hair, but she didn't mind. It was a moment of solitude, a moment to clear her thoughts. She didn't know what to do anymore. Just then, Alexander appeared, his tall frame filling the doorway. There was no mistaking the seriousness in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said simply. Emily turned to face him, her heart pounding. She knew this conversation was coming. She knew that what had happened between them couldn't stay buried forever. They met in Alexander's office, both of them aware of the weight of the moment. The city's skyline outside was bathed in the soft light of the late afternoon, but inside the room there was a palpable tension. "Emily," Alexander started, his voice calm but firm. "I know we can't pretend like nothing happened. That kiss, it changed things." Emily swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "I agree," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "But I don't think it should change anything professionally. We both know the stakes here. This company needs us to stay focused." "I agree," Alexander replied, pacing in front of her. "But we can't ignore what happened. The way I feel about you. I can't just brush that aside, Emily." She could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict she was feeling. She wasn't sure if it was desire or something deeper, but she couldn't afford to be distracted by emotions. "Alexander," she said, her voice tinged with a sense of finality, "we both have a lot at stake. We can't afford to let this affect our work. This company is everything. We have to stay focused, no matter what." He stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto hers. "So that's it. You're telling me to forget about everything. Forget about us." Emily's heart ached at the words. She wanted to be honest with him, but the fear of losing everything, her career, her position, the respect she had earned, was too great. "I'm not saying forget," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "But we have to be smart about this. We can't let our emotions cloud our judgment." Alexander took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "And what if I don't want to forget?" The air between them grew heavy, and for a moment all Emily could hear was the sound of her own breath. She wanted to reach out to him, to pull him into her arms and let everything else fade away. But she couldn't, not yet. Not when there was so much on the line. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what this is anymore, Alexander, but I do know that we can't afford to make this personal." For the next few days, they tried to return to business as usual. They worked together on the company's most crucial project, making sure everything ran smoothly. But every time their paths crossed, the tension between them was undeniable. The attraction was still there, simmering beneath the surface. And both of them were struggling to keep their emotions in check. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Alexander invited Emily to join him for a drink. It was a casual invitation, but Emily knew it wasn't just about the drink. It was about the unspoken words between them, the things they hadn't said. They met at a quiet bar, away from the office, where the world felt like it was far away. The dim lighting and soft music set the mood, but the tension between them was still palpable. After a few sips of whiskey, Alexander broke the silence. "Emily, I've been thinking about what you said, about how we need to stay focused on the company. And you're right. But I can't pretend that what's between us doesn't matter." Emily looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the pull, the undeniable connection between them. But she had to be careful. She couldn't let herself get lost in this. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too, but this, whatever it is between us, it can't get in the way of what we're building. Not now." Alexander reached across the table, his hand hovering just inches from hers. His touch was warm, his fingers so close, but he didn't move to touch her. "I don't know if I can just let this go, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know if I can ignore how I feel about you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment where everything would change. for better or for worse. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how they would navigate the storm that was brewing between them. But one thing was clear. There was no going back. After the tension-filled conversation between Alexander and Emily, things were never quite the same between them. They went back to work, focusing on the high-stakes project that would determine the future of Blake Enterprises. Yet, despite their professional commitment, the lingering unease between them was undeniable. Emily found herself constantly glancing at Alexander, wondering whether he still carried the same unresolved emotions she had. She couldn't focus on the business as well as she normally could. Every meeting, every email, felt like a reminder of the magnetic pull between them. For Alexander, it was no different. He had always been a man of control, but Emily's presence made him question everything. He found himself distracted, his thoughts frequently wandering to her intelligence, her strength, and the undeniable chemistry they shared. He didn't want to admit it, but he had to. He was falling for her, and the weight of that realization hung over him. The idea of mixing business with pleasure was dangerous, something he had always avoided. But with Emily, the line between the two had blurred. He couldn't decide if he was worried about losing the company or if he was afraid of losing her. Just as both of them were beginning to think that things might settle down, the first wave of crisis hit. Blake Enterprises was on the brink of losing a major contract with a key investor who had been with the company since the beginning. This deal was critical for the company's survival and its future growth. The reason? Emily's proposal, the same proposal she had fought so hard to push through, had been misinterpreted by the investor's team, leading to a severe breakdown in trust. As Emily entered Alexander's office, she was met with a silence that spoke volumes. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city, his face hard and unreadable. "Alexander," she began, her voice steady despite the rising panic in her chest. "I know the deal fell through, but we can fix this." "I can," he turned to face her, his expression dark. "You don't get it, Emily. This wasn't just a minor hiccup. This was a huge mistake, and the investor is pulling out. They're threatening to walk away from the entire project. I've worked for years to keep this company afloat, and your idea might just have cost us everything." Emily's stomach churned at his words, the weight of the consequences sinking in. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "But we still have a chance to turn things around. I'm sure I can fix it." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "You think so? You think you can just fix this like it's one of your financial spreadsheets? This isn't some small mistake we can just sweep under the rug. This is the future of Blake Enterprises, and you put that in jeopardy." The words stung, and Emily felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. "I didn't do it on purpose," she said, trying to keep her composure. "But if we work together. He interrupted, his tone sharp. "How can we be together when I can't trust you to handle something as important as this? Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? This isn't just a minor setback, it's a disaster." Emily's heart raced. She knew Alexander's temper could be fierce, but his words felt like a punch to the gut. She had always prided herself on her ability to fix problems, but this time she had failed. And now the consequences were catastrophic. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, replaying the confrontation over and over in her head. Alexander was right. She had made a critical mistake, and she knew it. But there was something else she had to admit to herself. She wasn't just worried about the project. She was worried about losing Alexander both as her boss, and as the man she had come to care about more than she was willing to admit. As she sat on the edge of her bed, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander. "We need to talk tomorrow morning. The meeting at 9 a.m. is crucial." Emily stared at the message for a long moment before typing a quick response. "I'll be there." "I'm sorry, Alexander." Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment longer, but she didn't type anything else. She couldn't find the right words. No matter what happened next, she knew that the road ahead was going to be far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The next morning, Emily arrived early at the office. The conference room was set up for the meeting, but as she walked in, she noticed Alexander wasn't in his usual confident, poised form. He was sitting at the head of the table, staring down at his laptop, looking more tired than she had ever seen him. She sat down across from him, her heart racing. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Neither of them knew where to start. "Look," she began, her voice tentative, "I know I messed up. But if you give me another chance, I swear I'll fix it. I can smooth things over with the investor." Alexander didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "You're not the only one who's messed up, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with frustration. "I pushed you too hard. I didn't give you the support you needed to succeed. But that doesn't change the fact that this could cost us everything." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I know, but I still believe in this company, Alexander. I know I can fix it." There was a long pause before Alexander leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "I'm not sure how much more I can trust you. Emily, you've got one shot to prove that you're capable of turning this around." She felt a sense of relief. But at the same time, the weight of the situation crashed down on her again. "I won't let you down." Just as the meeting seemed to be heading in a positive direction, a sudden phone call shattered the fragile peace between them. Alexander's phone rang, and he quickly answered. "What?" No, this can't be." His voice trailed off, and Emily watched him, her stomach sinking with dread. "Tell me everything," he said sharply, his hand gripping the phone tightly as he listened intently. Emily's eyes darted around the room, the tension mounting between them. After a few moments, Alexander hung up and ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "that wasn't just a warning. The investor is threatening to go public with everything. If they release the information, our competitors will jump on it, and the media will destroy our reputation." Emily's blood ran cold. This was far worse than she had anticipated. It wasn't just about a lost contract, it was about the entire company being at risk. The stakes had been raised higher than she could have ever imagined. The next few days were a blur for Emily and Alexander. The threat of a public scandal had escalated quickly, and it became clear that Blake Enterprises was on the brink of collapse. The investors' threats to release internal information about their mistakes could destroy the company's reputation overnight. No one could afford to let that happen. In an attempt to avert disaster, Alexander called a meeting with his closest allies, including Emily, to come up with a strategy to handle the crisis. Emily arrived early, her mind racing with ideas and plans, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she'd worked for could crumble. In the blink of an eye, as she entered the conference room, she was greeted by a somber Alexander, who stood by the window, staring out at the city. He looked like a man who had lost everything, but still refused to give up. "We need to move fast," Alexander said, his voice filled with urgency as he turned to face the team. We can't allow this investor to control the narrative. If we let this go public, it's over. Emily nodded, her thoughts sharp. We need to find a way to contain the damage. If they go public, our competitors will seize on it. The media will tear us apart. But if we can offer them something they can't refuse, maybe we can avoid the worst of it. There was a moment of silence as everyone in the room processed her words. Emily's plan was the best hope they had, but it was risky. She proposed offering the investor a larger stake in the company in exchange for their silence, giving them a seat at the table without giving up total control. It was a bold move, but it could work. We have one shot at this, Alexander said, nodding. If we're going to make this deal, it has to be flawless. Emily's mind raced with numbers and strategies as she and Alexander worked late into the night, crafting a proposal that would buy them the time they needed to fix the internal issues without completely handing over the company's future. As the days passed and their plan began to take shape, Emily and Alexander found themselves working more closely than ever. Despite the intense pressure of saving the company, the chemistry between them continued to simmer beneath the surface. The tension from their previous encounters lingered, but they were both too focused on the task at hand to let it distract them. However, the stress was beginning to take its toll on both of them. Late one night, as they reviewed documents in Alexander's office, Emily couldn't ignore the exhaustion in his eyes. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Emily said, her voice softer than usual. "We need to pace ourselves if we're going to pull this off." Alexander glanced up, his expression tense. "I don't have time to rest. We're running out of options, and I'm not going to let this company fail. Not after everything I've built." There was a quiet moment before Emily spoke again. "I understand. But you can't do this alone, Alexander. You need to trust me." He looked at her, the walls around him beginning to crack. "I know I've been hard on you. I know I've pushed you away at times. But this company, it's everything to me, and I can't lose it." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to him, her heart racing in her chest. She had fought so hard to keep her emotions in check. But this moment, this vulnerability, was more than she could ignore. "Together," she said, her voice steady, "we can make this work. You don't have to carry the weight alone." For a moment, it seemed like everything else disappeared. The tension between them felt different now, not as a professional divide, but as something deeper, more personal. But before either of them could say anything more, the sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. The call was from the investor. They wanted a meeting and they were demanding that Alexander meet them in person to discuss their terms. The meeting was set for the next day, and everything hinged on this conversation. Alexander knew that if he went in without the investor's full buy-in, the company would be exposed and torn apart by the media. As the meeting approached, Emily and Alexander's emotions were running high. They knew that this was their final chance to salvage everything. But there was a new tension between them, an unspoken bond, a shared responsibility, and a silent understanding that everything they were fighting for now was more than just business. It was personal. That night, as Emily prepared for the meeting, she received a mysterious message. It was brief, but filled with implications. "There's more you don't know. Be careful who you trust." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The message came from an anonymous number, but she knew instinctively that it was a warning. Who was it from? And what did they mean? The next morning, she told Alexander about the message. His face darkened as he listened to her, and for the first time, he showed a crack in his armor. "We're not just facing a business crisis," he said quietly. There's something bigger going on. We need to be careful. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated than a financial crisis. But for now, there was nothing they could do except go through with the meeting. The next day, Alexander and Emily sat across from the investor in a posh, private room in a downtown skyscraper. The investor who had remained faceless until now was a man of considerable power and influence. His piercing gaze examined them both as they laid out their offer. "You're asking for a lot," the investor said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "And I'm not sure I can accept it. Not without securing my own interests." The conversation dragged on, and with every passing minute, Emily could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Alexander, too, seemed increasingly uneasy, his usually calm demeanor slipping. But just as the investor seemed ready to walk away, Emily pulled out a final proposal, a last-ditch effort to save the deal. A move that would secure the investor's interests while maintaining the company's autonomy. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment Emily held her breath. This was the moment that would define everything. The investor paused, considering their offer. Then, in a move neither of them saw coming, he offered a counter-proposal, one that would require them to sacrifice more than they had planned. Alexander stared at the papers in front of him, a sinking feeling in his chest. "This isn't what we agreed to," he said, his voice tight. The investor's smirk deepened. "In business, things change, and so do deals." The meeting with the investor had left Alexander and Emily shaken, but neither of them had anticipated just how far the consequences of their choices would reach. The counter-proposal they had received, demanding more than they had expected, had put them in a precarious position. They were now facing a decision that would risk everything they had worked for. Back at Blake Enterprises, the pressure mounted. The stakes had never been higher, and the future of the company and their careers hung in the balance. Emily spent countless hours analyzing the investor's new terms, trying to find a way to make it work without sacrificing their integrity. But as the days passed, she began to uncover something even more troubling. One evening, while sifting through financial records in her office, Emily came across a set of transactions that didn't add up. There were large sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts, money that didn't correspond to any known project. It didn't take long for Emily to realize that someone inside Blake Enterprises had been orchestrating a hidden deal, one that had been concealed from the board and even from Alexander himself. As the realization hit her, Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Someone in the company had been using the current crisis to their advantage. But who and why? Emily knew she had to tell Alexander immediately. They couldn't afford another misstep. But as she walked into his office, her heart raced. She had spent days trying to find a way to salvage the situation, but now the truth was more dangerous than she had anticipated. "Alexander," Emily said, her voice low and urgent, "there's something you need to see. I think we have a serious problem inside the company." Alexander looked up from his desk, his face a mask of exhaustion. "What is it?" She handed him the documents, watching closely as his eyes scanned the numbers. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. "Who did this?" Alexander finally asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "This could ruin us." Emily shook her head, still processing the implications. "I don't know yet, but someone has been siphoning money from the company through offshore accounts. It's not just a mistake or a bad investment. This is deliberate." Alexander stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. How long has this been going on? It's hard to tell, Emily replied. The transactions go back months. Whoever's behind this has been very careful. For a moment, Alexander didn't say anything. The realization that someone within his own company had been betraying him, the very company he had built, hit him harder than he expected. His trust in everyone around him had already been shaken, but this was a different kind of betrayal. This can't be happening, Alexander muttered under his breath. I can't believe it. The more they dug into the transactions, the more Emily and Alexander realized that the plot ran deeper than either of them had imagined. The person behind the embezzlement was someone close to Alexander, someone he had trusted implicitly. After a thorough investigation, they discovered that it was James Harrington, the company's CFO, who had been orchestrating the entire scheme. James had been siphoning off funds for months, using the current crisis as a distraction to cover his tracks. The shock of it all made Alexander feel physically ill. James had always been someone Alexander trusted. They had worked together for years, and Alexander had relied on him to manage the financial stability of the company. To think that someone so close to him had been betraying him for so long made him question everything about his leadership. Are you sure about this? Alexander asked, his voice cold, as he stared at the evidence before him. I'm sure, Emily replied, her voice steady. The proof is undeniable. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The man who had been his right hand was the very person who could bring everything crashing down. He had always known that trust was a fragile thing. But this was a betrayal of a magnitude he hadn't prepared for. We need to act fast, Alexander said, his voice hardening. James must be stopped before this gets any worse. The next day, Emily and Alexander set up a meeting with James Harrington in the company's private conference room. The air was thick with tension as they waited for him to arrive. When James walked in, he was all smiles, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. Good morning, Alexander, Emily, James said cheerfully, settling into the chair across from them. What can I do for you? You know why we're here, James, Alexander said, his voice low and firm. You've been siphoning money from the company. The evidence is clear. James's face went pale as he realized what was happening. The color drained from his cheeks, and for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Alexander, I can explain, James stammered, his usual confidence crumbling. You don't understand. The company was in trouble. I was just trying to save us. Save us. Alexander repeated, his voice rising with anger. By stealing from us. You've betrayed everything we've built, James. James swallowed hard, looking between Emily and Alexander. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought it would be temporary. I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed. Emily shook her head in disbelief. You've been embezzling funds for months. This is deliberate, James. You've been using the crisis to cover your tracks. You're not just a thief. You're a criminal. For a moment, James looked defeated. His shoulders slumped as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling. I never meant to hurt anyone. I thought I was doing the right thing. Alexander stood up, his face hardening. You've destroyed any chance of redemption, James. You've hurt the company. You've hurt the people who trusted you, and you've hurt me. I'm done with you. James's eyes filled with desperation. Please, Alexander. Please don't do this. I'll fix it. I'll make it right. But Alexander wasn't listening anymore. He knew there was no going back from this. The damage had been done, and James Harrington was no longer part of Blake Enterprises. With James Harrington gone, the immediate crisis was over. But the damage had been done. Alexander felt betrayed, not just by James, but by himself. His trust in people had been shattered, and Emily could see the weight of the loss in his eyes. As Emily and Alexander sat together in his office after the meeting, the silence between them was heavy. They had survived this storm, but the future still looked uncertain. "I don't know who I can trust anymore," Alexander said, his voice raw with emotion. Emily placed a hand on the table between them, her voice soft. "You can trust me, Alexander. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, they both sat in silence, knowing that their world had just changed again. But this time, it wasn't just about saving the company, it was about saving themselves, together. The fallout from James Harrington's betrayal had reverberated through every corner of Blake Enterprises. Despite the fact that he was gone, the damage was far from over. The trust that had once been a cornerstone of the company's success now lay in tatters, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. He had fought so hard to build his empire, only to have it nearly torn apart by someone he had considered a friend, a brother almost. For days, Emily and Alexander worked tirelessly, trying to put out the fires that James had started. They'd had to reassure investors, clean up the mess left behind, and above all, rebuild the trust that had been lost. But through it all, Alexander couldn't help but feel the weight of the betrayal hanging over him. James had not just betrayed the company, he had betrayed Alexander, and that sting was still fresh. Despite the emotional toll, Emily remained by his side, offering not just her expertise, but her presence. She had been the one person he could count on, the one person who hadn't let him down. And yet, as they worked together to fix the damage, a new tension began to build between them. There was something unspoken between them now, a recognition of the feelings that had grown over the past few weeks. They had both felt their connection, the undeniable pull, but neither of them had the courage to address it. After everything that had happened, neither was sure they were ready to face that truth. One evening, after another exhausting day, Emily and Alexander found themselves alone in the company's sleek, glass-walled conference room. The city lights outside were fading into the night, the skyline bathed in a dim, golden glow. The room was empty except for the two of them, and despite the calm exterior, the tension between them was palpable. "Emily," Alexander began, his voice weary but filled with an intensity that caught her off guard. "I need to ask you something about everything that's happened." "About us?" Emily looked up at him, her heart racing in her chest. She had expected this conversation to happen eventually, but now that it was here, she found herself unsure of what to say. "We've been through a lot," he continued, walking around the room, his hands shoved into his pockets as he spoke. "And I can't deny that I've been distracted. I've been focused on the company, on the crisis, but at the same time, I haven't been able to ignore you. There's something here, Emily, something I didn't plan for." Her pulse quickened at the words, but she kept her face neutral. She couldn't let him see how much his words were affecting her. She had worked so hard to stay professional, to keep her emotions in check. But now, with everything that had happened, she felt her resolve beginning to crumble. "I don't know what you want from me, Alexander," she said, her voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm here for the company. I've always been here for the company. but I'm not sure I can separate that from what's between us. Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face her. The tension was thick, like an invisible force in the air between them. That's the problem, isn't it? He said softly. We've spent so much time pretending it's just about business. But it's not. Not anymore. I can't pretend like what happened between us doesn't matter. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she met his gaze. The raw honesty in his eyes made her feel exposed. I know, she whispered. I've been trying to keep it professional, but I don't know how much longer I can do that. The connection between us is real. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken truth between them growing heavier by the second. Emily wasn't sure if she was ready to face it, but she knew she couldn't deny it anymore. Alexander took a step closer to her, and Emily instinctively took a step back. Her mind was racing. This was a line they couldn't uncross. If they gave in to their feelings, everything would change. The professional boundary they had carefully maintained would be shattered, and once that happened, there was no going back. I can't stop thinking about you, Alexander admitted, his voice low and intense. And I don't want to, but I also don't want to mess this up. I've built my entire life around control, around being the one in charge. But with you, I don't feel in control anymore. Emily's breath hitched as she took in his words. She could feel the same pull toward him, but she didn't know if she could take that final step. We can't do this, Alexander, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. We're too much of a liability to each other. What if we can't separate our personal feelings from the work we need to do? His eyes softened, and for a moment Emily saw something vulnerable in him that she hadn't seen before. I don't know, he confessed, but I don't want to keep pretending it's not there. It's too strong, too real. With a final glance at her, he stepped back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. We're facing the biggest crisis this company has ever seen. Maybe it's not the time. Maybe we should focus on fixing everything first. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Just as they both tried to process the weight of their feelings, the door to Alexander's office burst open. One of the senior executives rushed in, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. Mr. Knight, Ms. Cooper, he said urgently, there's something you need to see. We just got news. There's a new leak in the press. Someone's gone public with the details of James's embezzlement. It's already starting to spread. Alexander's face tightened as he glanced at Emily. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Their personal issues would have to wait. The company was in danger again, and now they had to act quickly. We need to shut this down. Now, Alexander ordered, his voice returning to its usual firm tone. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. We'll fix it. We have no choice. The weight of the crisis had grown unbearable for Alexander and Emily. After the press leak, the company was scrambling to regain control of the situation. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the once stable foundation of Blake Enterprises was now on the verge of collapse. What had begun as a battle to protect their secrets had turned into an war to save the company's reputation. Despite their personal turmoil, Alexander and Emily worked tirelessly to manage the damage. They hired a PR firm, held emergency meetings with key stakeholders, and coordinated with the legal team to contain the fallout. But as the media onslaught intensified, both of them knew it was only a matter of time before the full truth came out. And when it did, the company would be tested like never before. Yet, despite the chaos surrounding them, something inside Alexander had shifted. He found himself depending on Emily more than he ever had before. Her calm under pressure, her razor-sharp focus, and her ability to think 2 steps ahead had become indispensable. She had proven herself time and again, and in the face of this crisis, her strength was the one thing that grounded him. Late one evening, as they sat in his office, reviewing damage control strategies, Emily looked at him, her face tired but determined. "We're close, Alexander," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that lined her face. "We can still fix this, but it's going to take everything we have." Alexander glanced at her, his mind racing. "And after everything we've done, after everything we've been through, do you think we can make it out of this?" His voice was quieter than usual, filled with doubt. Emily paused, considering the question. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know that we've come this far, and I'm not giving up now. Not after everything we've built." There was a brief silence between them as their eyes locked. Alexander felt something stir inside him, a deeper connection, a silent acknowledgement of what had grown between them. But even then, he knew they were too far into this battle to let anything else distract them. "I don't know what the future holds," Alexander said quietly, "but I know that whatever happens, I can't do this without you, Emily." For the first time, Emily smiled a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "You won't have to do it alone. We're in this together." The next day, as the company began to make progress in their efforts to contain the damage, a new twist threw everything into chaos. One of their senior executives, who had been working with Alexander for years, was suddenly accused of leaking sensitive company information to the media. The betrayal hit like a thunderbolt, and the realization that someone inside the company had been working against them crushed Alexander. "How could this happen?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief as he stared at the evidence in front of him. "How could someone from within do this to us?" Emily looked at him, her expression grim. "We need to act fast. If this person's been leaking information, the media will pounce on this like sharks. The damage could be worse than what we've already faced." Alexander took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I won't let this destroy us," he muttered. "Not after everything we've fought for." As they prepared to confront the traitor, Emily once again took charge, handling the delicate situation with the same composure that had earned her Alexander's respect. Together, they gathered their team to manage the crisis, but the situation was becoming more dire with each passing hour. The day of reckoning arrived, when Alexander and Emily stood face to face with the executive who had betrayed them, Charles. Donovan, the senior vice president of operations, had been with the company for nearly a decade. His betrayal shook Alexander to the core. "You've put all of us at risk." "Charles," Alexander said, his voice cold, his anger barely contained. "Why?" Charles didn't flinch. He was calm, almost too calm, as if he had been preparing for this moment. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice low. "I saw the cracks in the foundation, Alexander. Blake Enterprises was heading for disaster, and I wasn't about to go down with it." Emily stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "You chose to betray the people who trusted you. You chose your own survival over loyalty. That's not just a mistake, that's a crime." Charles looked at her, then back at Alexander. "I didn't betray anyone. I did what I thought was best for me. What's the point in sticking with a sinking ship?" The silence in the room was deafening. For a moment, Alexander didn't know what to say. He had trusted Charles, had considered him a friend. But now, that trust was shattered. "You're fired, Charles," Alexander said, his voice finally steady. though filled with a cold finality. And I'll make sure the law holds you accountable for everything you've done. As Charles was escorted out, Alexander and Emily stood together, their bodies still tense from the confrontation. The storm wasn't over yet, but they had taken another crucial step toward rebuilding. That evening, after the dust had settled, Alexander and Emily found themselves alone in the office once again. The crisis was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they were on solid ground. "We're not out of the woods yet," Emily said, her voice soft, her exhaustion evident. "But we're closer than we've been in weeks." Alexander nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "I know, but we're getting there. And no matter what happens, I'm not going to let go." He looked at her, a sense of clarity settling in his chest. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about her and the connection they had shared through all of this. "Emily," he said softly, stepping closer, "there's something I need to say before he could continue." Emily placed a hand gently on his chest. "I know, Alexander. I've felt it too." Their faces were inches apart, the distance between them shrinking with each passing second. But before they could close the gap, the phone rang, breaking the spell. It was a call that neither of them had expected. The phone call was from the investor, the one who had been threatening to go public with their issues. They had an ultimatum: either Alexander and Emily agree to their terms, or the media storm would become an unstoppable force, potentially bankrupting Blake Enterprises. With Emily at his side, Alexander knew what had to be done. He wasn't going to let anyone control the company or his future again. The decision they made would define the rest of their lives, both professionally and personally. As they prepared for the final negotiation, Emily turned to him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "I have to be," Alexander replied, his eyes steady. "This is it. We either fight for this company and for us, or we walk away." The door to their future was wide open, and while the path ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear: whatever they chose, they would face it together. The story ends with them walking into the unknown, hand in hand, as the sun began to set on Blake Enterprises, symbolizing a new chapter in both their lives, one filled with endless possibilities and uncharted territory. The final decision was theirs, and the future was theirs to shape.